Hello everyone, and thank you for your interest in this community history webinar series. This series is designed to showcase community and local history projects from throughout Canada. In each webinar, we will learn from project coordinators as they discuss their local history, the framework of the project, and highlight challenges they may have faced along the way. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I am the Online Engagement Coordinator for Canada's History Society, and I will be your host. Canada's History Society is thrilled to be able to offer this webinar series as we are dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through our publishing, education, and recognition programs. To learn more about Canada's History Society, I welcome you to visit canadashistory.ca. So today's webinar features Tracy Calogheros and Alyssa Tobin. Tracy has served as the CEO for the Exploration Place Museum and Science Centre in Prince George, British Columbia for nearly 24 years. Presently, she serves as the Vice Chair of the Canadian Association of Science Centres. Her work with the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation has resulted in the expanded collection and new permanent gallery, Hodul'eh-a, a Place of Learning, and an MOU between the museum and the nation to act as their repository while working together towards program development and repatriation of artifacts from around the globe. Alyssa Tobin is a curator at the Exploration Place in Prince George, British Columbia. A graduate of Simon Fraser University, her educational focus has been in archaeology, conservation, and First Nation studies. She has spent several years both in the field working as an archaeologist and in the curatorial department at the Exploration Place. She is passionate about the human history of the northern region of BC, loves the outdoors, and is always eager to deepen her understanding of the history of the place she calls home. I would like to welcome Alyssa and Tracy to begin their presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Tobin and I'm the curator at the Exploration Place. Tracy and I just want to start off and acknowledge that we're not Lheidli T'enneh and we do not speak on behalf of them. This webinar is being told completely from our perspective. We do, however, work closely together and really value and respect each other's perspectives. We thought we'd start off by filling in the listeners on some of the history of the place we call home. So the Lheidli T'enneh belong to the dugout people who have occupied the central part of the BC for thousands of years. The name Lheidli T'enneh means the people where the two rivers flow together. The traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation stretches over 4.3 million hectares from the Rocky Mountains to the interior plateau, and this includes the city of Prince George. So this photo features the village of Lheidli in 1891. Archaeological evidence supports many oral histories and provides evidence that the Lheidli have been in what is now the city of Prince George for at least 10,000 years. Fort George Reserve Number 1, as well as 3 others, were first laid out in 1892. Reserve Number 1, which is featured in this picture, consisted of over 1,300 acres, which covers all of present-day downtown Prince George. The Exploration Place is located in the newly renamed Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park. This park encompasses the historic Lheidli Cemetery and sits on the original village site of Lheidli. The importance of this site really can't be emphasized enough. As I mentioned before, in this place for at least 10,000 years, the Lheidli have followed the rhythms of the season and called this place home. So this image features the village of Lheidli in 1913. As the settler community grew and the railway was looking to expand, the reserve land that the Lheidli called home was becoming more valuable. The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway and the BC Express Company both became very interested in this valuable piece of land and competed over the property. This resulted in both companies applying a great pressure to the Lheidli to sell, often through false pretenses and false authorization. All sources consistently reveal that the Lheidli T'enneh actively resisted the demand to surrender this land. After 3 years of disjointed negotiations, the GTP acquired Fort George Reserve Number 1 on November 18, 1911. When the time came to move during the first week of September 1913, the chief stated that the people really didn't want to move. Not to mention, as you can see in this picture, that they were relying on the food in the gardens to make it through the winter. After facing subsequent resistance, the Indian agent created a plan with some of the GTP workers to start burning vacant homes at the north end of the village. When the Lheidli people saw the workers igniting the first house, they ran to the agent and asked him to stop the burning of the village and all their possessions. Fearful of further arson, they agreed to start moving the next day. As soon as the village was vacated, its buildings were burned to the ground, and the only thing that remained was the cemetery, which you can see in this picture, as it remained Fort George Reserve 1A. In the third week of September 1913, the first lots were auctioned off in what was to become downtown Prince George, and of course, the railway profited from this sale. This is the history of where the museum's located. So how do you begin to regain trust and build a relationship when this is the dark history of the land the museum is located on?
It was that backdrop, this is Tracy speaking now, that I joined the museum in 1994 against. I had just come into Prince George. I knew nothing of the history of the area, and I had found myself a job working as the marketing and graphics coordinator here at the museum. In this photo in front of you, a number of the gentlemen that were involved in not only hiring me, but in getting us started on a real relationship build with the Lheidli T'enneh are pictured. George Phillips was the director who hired me, and the two gentlemen in the center on the left is Chief Barry Seymour. George Phillips is the other gentleman beside him on the right. This is the archway that was created at the entrance to the cemetery in what was still then Fort George Park. And it was the first time that we had worked closely with the Lheidli T'enneh on a project of significance to their cultural heritage. At this time, we also established a seat on the museum board for a Lheidli appointee, and we also had our first induction of Lheidli elders as life members at the museum. As we continue to work towards not only understanding the past, but starting to share that past, we decided that we would begin with a traveling exhibit that had been created out of Ottawa called Where Are the Children? This exhibit focused on the residential school story, and at this time, I had never heard anything about a residential school. Growing up in Southern Ontario, it wasn't part of the curriculum. It wasn't anything that I had ever been taught. So we brought this exhibit in, and most people that came to the exhibit were in the same boat. They knew nothing about the history of residential schools. It did have a small local component where we did some work through our curatorial department with a youth in the area, and we created the story of the Lheidli School, which was also from this part of the world. It was profound for myself and for my staff, as well as for the community. There were groups that brought healing circles, and it was the first time we had had anything like that happen within these walls here at the museum. We were faced with a non-Indigenous community indignation and denial. There was a fair bit of that at my front desk, and it gave us the opportunity not only to see just what Indigenous folks had been being subjected to broadly, but also to understand ourselves that there was so little understanding in that community, not the Indigenous community, the non-Indigenous community, of what actually had happened and what impacts that it had. The most compelling statement to me at that time was an elder who had come through, and she told me that it was the first time she'd ever been able to speak to her grandchildren about what had happened to their parents. And walking them through the exhibit and looking at the photographs, she felt that she had finally been able to reach some understanding with the kids about some of the trauma and the problems that their parents were dealing with. We decided at the end of this traveling exhibit that we really needed to tell the September 1913 story, and that was our next attempt. So we built an exhibit in consultation with elders and chief and council to talk exclusively about the expulsion of the Lheidli T'enneh from Fort George Park. This exhibit again was very controversial. It was brave on the part of my board to allow us to do this project, and brave on the part of the Lheidli to be willing to tell that story. The exhibit again had much discussion. There was a broadening of understanding in the larger community about what had actually happened, and local media got very interested in starting to explore those stories as well. In fact, the story itself traveled far enough that we had the first repatriation of material culture from the Lheidli There was a woman who contacted us from Washington with a large collection of baskets that were from the Fort George Indian Band, which is what the Lheidli had been referred to at the time, and she shipped all of that back up to the museum for us to be able to have here. So with the successes that we had had in those first two exhibits, which really was looking at the dark post-contact history component, it was time to start looking at the Lheidli prior to contact. And there had started to be some excavations in the area, and lithics had been unearthed and dated that would now conclusively show that there had been human habitation in the area for 10,000 years. So we embarked on developing cultural expressions, which was truly the largest exhibit that we had done, and this was at the request of the Lheidli Chief and Council. They were looking for an exhibition that would not only tell the story about where they had come from in time immemorial, but also look to the future and look to who the Lheidli were and who they were becoming. And cultural expressions was really aimed at that. They were hosting the Provincial Elders Gathering here in Prince George, and this exhibit became the central social feature for the conference. We hosted a large event here with elders from all across the province, and there was a lot of discussion during that event about how did the Lheidli manage to get the museum interested? How did the Lheidli get us to be involved? And comments like, we wish that we had a museum like this at home. And it was eye-opening for us to realize that there weren't other museums doing this sort of work and developing this kind of a relationship. This was a celebratory moment. It was future-focused, but we weren't ignoring the dark pasts of the post-contact history. We were simply acknowledging that they had happened and that that is part of what has gone into building the strong people that the Lheidli are today. So moving forward from there, the Lheidli T'enneh became the first ever host nation for the Canada Winter Games when we hosted here in Prince George, and they had the opportunity to share their culture very broadly for the first time in a national venue. They had their own pavilion, which they took elements of the cultural expressions exhibit and installed into a pavilion and welcomed the entire country to their traditional territory, and they did it in a beautiful way. So the shift in public perception was becoming more and more widespread. There was now general understanding of what had happened in 1913 and that the Lheidli had been in this area forever. The City Council voted on June 17, 2015 to take the name Fort George Park off of this very important space and name it in honor of Lheidli T'enneh. So we are now the Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park, and Exploration Place is still in the heart of that space. There was, again, more public backlash when the park was renamed, and it actually this time around generated a really good discussion on racism and on how organizations, not only in the media, but an organization like a museum, is to have a role in trying to combat that and build understanding. We've continued to build from there. We have begun hosting additional events for the Lheidli T'enneh. Like in this image, it's their Chief and Council swearing-in ceremonies. We've done another large induction for elders as life members. And we now have 2 additional Lheidli members on our Board of Governors that stood for election as general members. And so it's slowly becoming more and more their home as well as our own. Here you can see the Lheidli T'enneh are working on a dugout canoe project. This is directly outside of the museum here in Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park. We hired local elder Robert Frederick, who put together a team to carve this dugout canoe in the traditional style. Over 150 people of all nationalities participated over 3 weeks, and it was interesting to me when Robert commented that this was the first time one of these canoes had been carved in this area in over 100 years. They managed to get it done in time to race it in the Northern Hardware Canoe Race down the Nechako River and into the Fraser. You can see here Lheidli artist Jennifer Piggin and her crew that paddled this boat. It was pretty entertaining because by the time it got all the way to the end of the race, it was such a fresh log that it had soaked up an awful lot of water, and it took something like 20 people to get it back up out of the water. And then it took us weeks to dry it out to be able to bring it back into the museum.
Tracy and I raced in that race as well in a larger light canoe, and they were only 6 minutes behind us, so they were paddling pretty hard.
It was pretty neat. This canoe is now a centerpiece in our new permanent gallery, Hodul'eh-a. And there are other interesting byproduct of this, that there's now others being made in town, whether it's up at the university or at Nusdiyo, the First Nations Choice School. This inspired people to realize that it was an interesting project and something that they could do themselves. And the culmination, June 21st, 2017, a little like a wedding. The Memorandum of Understanding formalized the roles and responsibilities that had been evolving over 2 decades between the Lheidli T'enneh Nation and the Exploration Place Museum and Science Center. This picture here is Chief Dominic Frederick signing that MOU that we've been working on for so long. And I think it's important to acknowledge the bravery that this took, for him to sit and take a deep breath and say, yep, okay, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to sign this agreement, and we're going to see how this works out this time around. So far, this particular agreement signed here in Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park is wonderfully successful on both sides. We had at this time then done a full transfer of the entire collection that we were holding of Lheidli T'enneh cultural material, and we became the designated repository for the Lheidli T'enneh, opening the first permanent Lheidli gallery, as I said, Hodul'eh-a. All right, back over to you, Alyssa.
All right, so Hodul'eh-a, a place of learning, began construction in 2016, but the relationship between the exploration place and the Lheidli T'enneh First Nations, as Tracy said, has been built over many years. The Lheidli T'enneh Chief and Council, as well as the Elders Group, engaged in multiple consultations with us and made vastly significant contributions to the conception, content, language, and the style of the gallery. The Exploration Place and Lheidli T'enneh opened this new gallery together. So the ladies that are in this picture are very special to us. They are Lheidli T'enneh elders. So Edie Frederick is on the right, and she was a huge help with the gallery, and her mother, Josie Paul, is on the left. One thing we wanted to share is before opening, Edie described her experience as working on this project as incredible, and she said it was like working with family, and that was really special to Tracy and I and everyone involved in the project. She brought her mother in to do a cedar bough smudging in advance of the opening, and shared with us that this was deeply rewarding and significant to them both, as they didn't think they'd have the chance to heal so many wounds in what was now Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park. So that was really special. This is another elder we did some consultations with. So we made several trips out to different communities to meet with different elders and gather more information. This particular lady is from Saika's First Nation, which is about an hour and a half out of Prince George. She has a close family in Lheidli, and she was a huge help in identifying makers of some of the objects. So she's helping with repatriation, and she's also loaned materials for this exhibit. And I just love this picture of her, so I had to share it. So this isn't the best picture of me, but it is a great story. So with consultation and partnership projects like this one's comes mistakes. And we did make mistakes, but humor is really important. Laughing at yourself and owning the mistakes is important in any relationship. In this picture is Lheidli Elder Clifford Quall laughing at my big mistake and making me retell the story, and I've promised I'll tell it again. So when we first started talking about the gallery name and what we wanted it to be, we really wanted it to be some sort of place of learning. And that's kind of what we ran with. So between Tracy and I and elders, we all were thinking of a name for this gallery. I am not fluent in Dakelth, so I was reading through the Carrier Dakelth dictionaries, which are not only in the Lheidli dialect, but all dialects. I found this word that I thought was learning, which was Hodul'eh, and I found another word which was Ket, which I thought was the place of, so I put them together, and Ket Hodul'eh, and I thought, okay, perfect, the place of learning. So Tracy and I kind of ran with this. We sent out press releases, we put it on pamphlets, we talked about it on the news. We were both really excited. So then comes one of our last consultation days. We print out something for the elders, we give it to them, and before the meeting even starts, Edie, which was in that prior picture, comes to Tracy and I laughing hysterically. I mean, she has tears coming down her face, she can hardly talk, and she tells us she has something really important to let us know. And through the tears of laughter, she tells us that we've made a huge mistake in the name of our gallery. So at this point, I'm embarrassed and I'm wondering what it is. And through her laughter, she tells us that we actually named it the Place of Learning to Make Love. And as she's laughing, and now all the elders are laughing, she tells us that's actually the polite way of saying it. So it was a little inappropriate. We were a little embarrassed, but it brought us all closer together as a group, and we all can laugh about it now, like Clifford's laughing in that picture. And we recently made another little blunder, which we're all laughing about, and Tracy can fill you guys in on that one.
Oh, good. I get to tell that story. So we're hosting the Canadian Association of Science Centers Conference, and we wanted it to feed off of the work that we've been doing with the Lheidli T'enneh. So we had worked with an elder and come up with the name Lheidli T'enneh. Now, I am also not DeKalb, a native speaker of DeKalb, and so I've anglicized my pronunciation of it, and I was talking to one of our youth from the Lheidli who is going to be doing some drumming at the conference, and when I told him that its name was Lheidli T'enneh, he started to laugh. And he said, Tracy, you have to pronounce that properly. You need to get the guttural sound in lul, because to say Lheidli T'enneh, I guess that's how a toddler would refer to male genitalia. So instead of working together, I was saying that there was a working weenie. It was a little bit much. I don't know why we always end up talking about sex and we mess up the language.
I don't know, but it is embarrassing. So back to seriousness. As we said, both the Lheidli T'enneh and the museum wanted it to be a place where cultural learning and practice takes place. So we needed to ensure that everyone who entered would feel comfortable and welcome. This photo features John, who built a huge portion of this gallery. We couldn't have done it without him. It was built entirely in-house and features a stylized pit house entry. That's what John's working on there. Large cases displaying archival and textile objects, the new dugout canoe that we had worked on, photographic and documentary materials, as well as culturally modified trees, and most importantly, room to grow, so room to add later. We were really lucky to receive some smaller local grants working on this gallery. The community really was excited about it as well. And we received $75,000 from the province of BC in Canada 150 funding. So we would have gone ahead with the project anyways, but not to the extent that we did without that Canada 150 funding. It was really important. So something else that's really important to mention is the repatriation. Tracy kind of touched on it when she was talking about the MOU. So with the MOU, the exploration place transferred all materials in our collection that were Lheidli back to the Lheidli T'enneh Nation, and this is really important. So as we worked on this gallery, several other collections came to the museum and thus were transferred back to the Lheidli. The items that were not Lheidli are items that we are holding in the collection, but with the partnership of the Lheidli are actively researching to repatriate back to other communities. This image features our assistant curator Dave putting up a series of images that were digitally donated before this gallery as part of a Lheidli family photo collection. So there's over 1,000 images starting in the very early 1900s, and elders are helping us identify who's actually in these pictures. This is a deer rib vest and another example of a collection that was repatriated back. This is a large collection of Lheidli T'enneh cultural items that came from a sawmill owner in Prince George. The McLeans owned a sawmill in the early days and employed many Lheidli T'enneh community members, and they also lived in close proximity to the community. They became good friends with many of the families, and when the gentleman passed, he wanted to return these items to the community, and he did, which was really exciting. And this deer rib vest is now on display in the gallery as well. This is another collection that was brought back. So as we were researching the gallery, we found out that the diocese in Prince George was holding a large collection of First Nations materials, not only Lheidli, but belonging to the broader DeKalb community. So we spent days inventorying this collection when we found it, and it was transferred back to the museum. This will eventually be repatriated back to all of the communities that it belongs to. We're actively working with elders and going through and identifying which communities these items come from. So that's going to be a little bit of a longer process, but an important one as well. So this is the finished product. The gallery is a living gallery, which means it will change, it will grow, new items will come through. We're really excited about the opportunities and projects that come along with this gallery. So this case was built entirely in-house. Like I said, we couldn't have done it without John. He took a little bit of money and made it go really far. This is another gallery shot. So many of the items that are on display are items that haven't been looked at in years. This is a place of learning, and it's told from the perspective of the Lheidli T'enneh community. So the elders chose each item that's on display. They told the story that goes along with that. We were really just curating this gallery for them. So although we have things we want to add, we're really pleased with what we have accomplished so far together. We've learned firsthand the importance of friendship, inclusiveness, and working together. And we really believe projects like this are steps we can all take towards reconciliation. Education is crucially important. So we thought we'd share a few slides of opening day. We opened on National Indigenous Peoples Day in 2016, and a huge crowd, the Lheidli T'enneh community, turned out. Chief Frederick was able to cut the ribbon, and it was a really special moment for us to be a part of. Big smiles on everyone's faces in this picture. So Tracy's to the left, Chief Frederick's in the middle, and our chair, David Bird, is on the right. Another shot of David and Chief Frederick shaking hands after the ribbon cutting. And this is part of the crowd turnout. So as you can see, it was quite well attended. But really, what's next? What's so special about a gallery? We have built this gallery, but we have so many other projects on the horizon and so many other ideas we want to do. So Tracy's going to talk about what's next in our partnership.
So Alyssa's talked a little bit about the repatriation of artifacts, both back to Prince George from partner institutions and then from our collection to other First Nations in the area. We've had some initial discussions with the Canadian Museum of History and the Royal BC Museum, and I'm very excited about not only the materials that we're starting to discover are being held in collections unidentified, but also the willingness of the entire industry to really work together towards reconciliation in a meaningful way. We have received funding from the BC Arts Council to hire an Indigenous curatorial intern for the next 2 years. We've started interviewing on that. Our intention is to hire youth from the Lheidli T'enneh Nation, and they will work closely with Alyssa and her team in a paid position over the next 2 years and start to learn how to curate and to maintain this collection for themselves. We also have an online database that holds all of our collection, and we have a partition within that created just for the Lheidli T'enneh. Part of this Indigenous curatorial interns work will be to populate that part of the online database so that all of the collections that the Lheidli are holding will be more easily available, not just for their own people, but for anyone and for research as well. We're also looking at, in particular, some of the items coming out of the diocese collection for conservation work. This is a picture of Chief Frederick and I with Governor General Julie Payette. The partnership and this presentation was honored in Ottawa by Canada's History and by the Governor General just before Christmas, and I can't tell you how much this has impacted not only the Lheidli T'enneh but the museum itself. The honor is incredible, and it has given validity and support for all of the work and the risks that we've taken jointly over the last number of years. It's giving us the opportunity now to explore other new projects like the Shelley Church restoration. You may have noticed there was a large stained glass window in Hodul'eh-a, and it seems an odd choice to have a Catholic image like that in the midst of a gallery, but the elders were very determined to have those windows featured. We're holding them for the Lheidli here in the vault here at the museum, and they come from a church that's out at Shelley. The windows themselves are spectacular, and so that's why that is in there, but they need to do a complete restoration of that church. We're also working on curriculum-based programming on local First Peoples for grades 3 and 7. Our teaching and learning department is working closely with not only School District 57 and the elders, but also with Ms. de Yo, the First Nations Choice School in the area. And as We told the story already. We are hosting the Canadian Association of Science Centers Conference here in Prince George in May, Lheidli T'enneh, and we will be bringing in a number of speakers to really talk about how we can start to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching with science literacy and science-based programming. This image is Mary Gucci. She is 97 years old. She is an elder of the Lheidli T'enneh. Alyssa and I went and met with her and her granddaughter for some time to do an oral history with her. And over the course of that conversation, she had talked about wanting to come down to the museum to see this gallery, but she's 97 years old. So we opened up late for her, and her grandkids came with her. And she spent a lot of time with us, sharing her knowledge, identifying people, and generally participating in the point behind this gallery and this space within the museum. She's one of the few Lheidli dialect speakers left, and she is one of the ones that is just so able to help us as we start to try and collect some of this information so that it is all in one place. One of the things that we're holding are a large collection of Dakelth language tapes in the museum collection that need to be ported over to a new media, and so we are in the process of trying to find funding to be able to get these treasures transferred over to a media that will retain their integrity off into the future. This also is Mary, and it was so moving to take these pictures down off the wall and let her go through them. It was very much going through a family photo album. She was related to many of the people. She knew almost all of the people. And I've seen this very same thing happen with more than one elder. They come into the gallery and they're not quite sure of how to orient themselves, and this wall of family photos attracts them. And they'll stand there for quite a long time telling us who the people are in the pictures before they then move on to deal with the material culture and the feelings that come up from the rest of the gallery. So this particular wall of family photos is incredibly powerful, and it gives them a way to see themselves in the space, and in particular in the space that is Lheidli T'enneh Memorial Park. The gallery itself is offering wonderful opportunities for teaching and for sharing. This is Alyssa working with a group of traveling students that came through before the gallery was finished. So we had the chance to talk to them, basically the same conversation we're having with all of you today. And so at that time, we weren't really talking about material culture. We were talking about how to make a friend, how to have a partnership. And truly, it isn't a corporate partnership. This is a friendship that we have with the Lheidli T'enneh, and that's always based on trust and history. You can see in this shot that the use for this pit house that we've built within the museum is actually very traditional. It's a place to gather and a place to share stories, and it evolves with whatever the use is that we're putting it to at a given time. So we're now stepping up to become the Secretariat for the Elders Society, and we are creating a more formal structure for that group of knowledge keepers. The idea being that if we provide the staff support that they need, they'll be able to start to work on projects that are important to them and to train new elders as they come of age. This particular piece, this shot, is from the Cultural Expressions exhibit when we had it on, and the full body in the foreground depicts, well, it is a healer's outfit from a Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief's family. Our board has already approved the return of this object to the rightful owners, and we're working with Chief Frederick to determine the proper protocols around that return. We're hoping to do that this summer, but it is the first time that we're doing a repatriation beyond simply returning the full collection to the Lheidli. So we want to figure out what the proper process is for it, how it's going to work, and move ourselves forward, because as Alyssa has said, we have a large number of objects and artifacts that we really need to begin to repatriate to groups beyond the Lheidli T'enneh. And it's that friendship with the Lheidli T'enneh that is allowing us to start to have those conversations with other First Nations where we don't have a long history or connection. So in closing, we'd really like to emphasize that the members of the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation have been patient with us. The resulting exhibit and programming space is relevant, usable, and professional, and we're excited to continue filling the space with Lheidli T'enneh voices and cultural programming. So I will say to you now, Masi Cho, which is thank you. I could say Snechalia, but one of the things I have learned is Snechalia is also thank you, but it is a more formal thank you where a debt is implied. And so Today, I will close with Mussy Cho.
Thank you. We can take any questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, they can type into that right little bar there, and I can read them out, and Tracy and I will do our best to answer them. I think Jessica is also going to provide everyone with our emails, our contact information, so if you have more personal questions or stories you want to share with us, you can feel free to email Tracy and I, and we are happy to answer that way as well. Thank you, Joel. We're just reading your thank you, and we appreciate that. And Jessica, you are very welcome. We hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. Like I said, feel free to reach out to Tracy and I. We're happy to help, happy to answer questions. We're both really excited about this project and think it's really meaningful. And I think a small thing everyone can do as they're working towards reconciliation is really just realizing whose traditional territory you're on. One of the first things I think Tracy and I both learned when we came to Prince George, is neither of us are originally from here, is the traditional territory. We're located on the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. So do your best to learn whose territory you're on, maybe learn a traditional greeting, and talk to someone that's from that community. And those are really important first steps towards reconciliation. All right. Well, I think that's it. Does anyone have anything to add before we sign off here? Oh, I'm just reading one question. Do you have advice for other museums who want to repatriate objects from their collections?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is figure out where that object comes from, and then reach out not only to another museum in that area, but through to the First Nation where the object actually belongs. There's value for sure in working with whatever the local museum is in the originating First Nation territory, but it's about friendship. And when you're coming to them and saying, we have this and we think it's yours and we think you should have it back, generally speaking, we've always been met with pleased smiles. It's never been a problem.
That's a good news story. You're trying your best. You're working towards reconciliation. You're working towards repatriation, and generally you're going to be met with happiness and gratefulness. So I think it's just a really positive thing. Do we have any other questions? You can see Jessica's typing. This particular photo is actually from one of the smudging ceremonies that Josie and Edie did. So this hung in the entrance to our gallery opening, and then when the boughs died, we were to burn it afterwards, and that burned away any bad spirits. So we did do that.
Yeah, it was a really interesting process, that smudging with water and cedar boughs.
Yeah, this particular one is not cedar, we realize that, but similar ceremony.
Yeah. Neither Alyssa or I have ever given a webinar before, so we don't know what we're supposed to do next. All right, here we go. Do you have advice for museums and communities who are thinking about applying for the Governor General's History Award for community programming? Well, do it is my advice. The whole entire experience from beginning to end has been wonderful. Not only is it an honor to be in the group, but you learn from the other nominees, you learn from the other award winners, and it forces you to take a step back and look objectively at your project or at your community and really acknowledge the work that you've done. Sometimes with a project like this that has evolved over a couple of decades, you don't recognize just how far you've come because you're too close to it. So by going through the process of applying for something like the Governor General's History Award, it forces you to stop and to look objectively at what you've done. And sometimes just that is enough to make you realize not only have you done a lot of work, but to kind of give you some direction for your next steps. The experience in Ottawa was phenomenal as well. It's not very often that I'm nervous at a microphone, and I have to say, stepping up to speak in Rideau Hall was a life experience for me that I will never forget, and I'm grateful for it. So I would encourage anyone else to do the same thing.
And the other thing is you're meeting new friends, new connections, and that's going to help you in the long run. with winning this award, this is how Tracy and I have come to do this webinar. We met Jessica, and she allowed us to share our story with you guys. And if our story being shared allows you to start doing this sort of work as well, or at any other institution or organization, then I think it's well worth the work.
There's lots of talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think people aren't sure where to start sometimes. And we started this work before there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so we jumped in with both feet and blundered our way through, and it's been very successful. And I would encourage anyone else to take exactly the same approach. If you go in with an open heart and good intentions, everybody knows it, and it's okay to make mistakes. Just own them and move forward.
And laugh about them.
Laugh about them.
If they're anything like ours. All right. Jessica, you have any other questions?
Great. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm glad you spent the morning with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, and we look forward to maybe hearing from some of you through email.
Or come visit us. Prince George is a great place to visit.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tracy and Alyssa, for your presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you saw this presentation from the History Forum, I know you definitely learned a little bit more today, and the enthusiasm and the humor that both Tracy and Alyssa bring to their presentations. It's just such a pleasure to learn from you both. So thank you again for that, and I am excited to share this with our audience as well.
Thanks so much for having us. Masi Cho.
Thank you. Masi Cho.